The Dichotomy of Leadership, Balancing the Challenges of Extreme Ownership to Lead and Win, by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. Read by the authors.
Dedicated to the big, tough frogmen of SEAL Team 3 Task Unit Bruiser, especially Mark Lee, Mike Mansour, and Ryan Job, who laid down their lives. Chris Kyle, a friend and a legend. And Seth Stone, the Delta Platoon Commander, our brother. May we honor them always. War is a nightmare. It is awful, indifferent, devastating, and evil. War is hell. But war is also an incredible teacher, a brutal instructor. We learned lessons in war written in blood about sorrow, loss, and pain. We also learned about the fragility of human life and the power of the human spirit. Of course, we learned about strategy and tactics. We learned how to most effectively take the fight to our enemies. We learned how to analyze targets, gather and exploit information, find our enemies' weaknesses, and capitalize on them. We applied these lessons and made the enemy pay for their transgressions. But of everything we learned, nothing is as universal and transferable as how we came to truly understand the power of leadership. We saw how successful leaders could create victory where victory seemed impossible. We also witnessed how poor leadership could bring defeat upon teams that seemed invincible. We discovered firsthand that the principles of leadership are simple but not easy. There are strategies, techniques, and skills that take time and practice to utilize effectively. The foremost requirement for potent leadership is humility, so that leaders can fully understand and appreciate their own shortfalls. We learned much on the battlefield and have tried to pass those lessons on, but we are still humbled every day by our mistakes and all that we continue to learn. This book builds upon our first book, Extreme Ownership: How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. It is the follow-on book that so many readers of Extreme Ownership asked us to write. We have laid out the concepts in the Dichotomy of Leadership with clear descriptions and context so that it can be read and understood independently of the first book. For further explanation of the overviews given in the following pages, readers may want the deeper understanding and background provided in Extreme Ownership. But while it may be helpful to understand the first book for greater enlightenment, it is not essential. In both books, we reference our experiences in the military where we both served as SEAL officers. The bulk of our lessons learned draw from the Battle of Ramadi in 2006, where we served as the leaders of SEAL Team 3 Task Unit Bruiser. During that battle, the SEALs from Task Unit Bruiser fought with incredible bravery and tenacity. They delivered huge impact on the battlefield. But Task Unit Bruiser also suffered severe casualties. Those sacrifices will never be forgotten. Upon our departure from active duty in the U.S. Navy, we launched a company, Echelon Front, to share the lessons we learned with leaders in every capacity. In 2015, we published Extreme Ownership. Through that book, leaders all over the world embraced its fundamental principles: the mindset of extreme ownership and the 4 laws of combat: cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command. More than 1 million readers have taken those tenets and implemented them in their professional and personal lives with extraordinary results. But employing these principles to the fullest proves challenging. The nuances, if neglected or misunderstood, create obstacles difficult to overcome. We wrote this book to provide the granular insight and understanding that often render the difference between success and failure. This book will enable you to better process, analyze, and apply these leadership principles to your battlefield, in whatever arena that might be, whether leading in combat, business, or life. The format of the Dichotomy of Leadership mirrors that of extreme ownership. There are 3 parts to the book, 4 chapters in each part, and 3 sections to each chapter. The first section of each chapter describes an experience from combat or SEAL training. The second section discusses the relevant principle. And the third provides the direct application of the concept to the business world. The Dichotomy of Leadership is not a memoir or a history of the Iraq War. As we said in Extreme Ownership, this book is about leadership. It was written for leaders of teams large and small, for men and women, for any person who aspires to better themselves. Though it contains exciting accounts of SEAL combat operations, this book is a collection of lessons learned from our experiences to help other leaders achieve victory. If it serves as a useful guide to leaders who aspire to build, train, and lead high-performance winning teams, then it has accomplished its purpose. The combat and training experiences we describe are all true stories, but they are not meant for historic reference. The dialogues we have written are intended to impart the message and meaning of conversations. They are imperfect and subject to the passage of time and the shortfalls of memory. We have also concealed specific tactics, techniques, and procedures and ensured that no classified information about when and where specific operations took place and who participated in them is revealed. In accordance with U.S. Department of Defense requirements, the manuscript was submitted and approved through the Pentagon Security Review process. We do not use the name of our SEAL teammates unless they are names of our fallen or they are SEALs already in the public eye. Our brothers still on active duty in the SEAL teams are silent professionals who seek no recognition, and we treat our responsibility to protect them with the utmost seriousness. We have taken the same precautions to protect the incredible soldiers and Marines we served with in the Battle of Ramadi and elsewhere. Their names fill our memories with the extraordinary leadership, sacrifice, and heroism they demonstrated. But to ensure their privacy and security, we do not use their names in this book unless they are already known to the public. Similarly, we have taken every measure to protect confidentiality for the clients of our leadership consulting company, Echelon Front. We have refrained from using company names, changed the names and titles of individuals, and in some cases abstained from using industry-specific information or altered it. As in Extreme Ownership, while the stories we tell from the business world are based directly on real experiences, in some cases we have combined situations, condensed timelines, and modified details to protect confidentiality or more clearly emphasize the underlying principles we are trying to illustrate. It has been gratifying to witness the worldwide reach and impact of Extreme Ownership, particularly in the success that so many readers have achieved through its guiding principles. But there are those who misunderstood the title of the book and its powerful foundational principle, the mindset and attitude of extreme ownership. In most cases, rather than extremes, leadership requires balance. Leaders must find the equilibrium between opposing forces that pull in opposite directions. Being aggressive but cautious, disciplined but not rigid, a leader but also a follower. It applies to almost every aspect of leadership. Achieving the proper balance in each of the many dichotomies is the most difficult aspect of leadership. We wrote the Dichotomy of Leadership to help leaders understand this challenge and find the balance needed to most effectively lead and win. No matter the arena, balance must be achieved for optimal performance. If a leader imposes too much authority, the team becomes reluctant to execute. Not enough, and the team has no direction. If leaders are too aggressive, they put the team and the mission at risk. Yet if they wait too long to take action, results can be equally catastrophic. If a leader trains his or her people too hard, they may burn out. Yet without challenging and realistic training, the team remains unprepared for real-world situations they may face. The dichotomies go on and on, each one requiring balance. Since the release of extreme ownership, as we worked with thousands of leaders from hundreds of companies and organizations, the majority of questions we received were around this concept, this struggle, achieving balance in the dichotomy of leadership. We wrote this book to specifically address those questions. Just as we described in the preface of Extreme Ownership, we don't have all the answers. No one does. But we learned extremely humbling and valuable lessons as battlefield leaders, both from our failures and our successes. Often, our mistakes and failures provided the most valuable lessons that helped us learn and grow. We continue to learn and grow to this day. As the dichotomy of leadership builds upon the concepts in extreme ownership, the words from the preface of our previous work are applicable. We wrote this book to capture those leadership principles for future generations, so that they may not be forgotten, so that as new wars begin and end, such crucial lessons will not have to be relearned, rewritten in more blood. We wrote this so that leadership lessons can continue to impact teams beyond the battlefield, in all leadership situations. Any company, team, or organization in which a group of people strives to achieve a goal and accomplish a mission. We wrote this book for leaders everywhere to utilize the principles we learned to lead and win.
Introduction. Finding the Balance. Leif Babin. J Block, South Central Ramadi, Iraq, 2006. Stand by to get some, someone said over the inter-squad radio, in the calm demeanor you might expect of a flight attendant telling airline passengers to stow their tray tables for landing. The street in front of us had emptied of people. Like magic, the local citizens had all suddenly disappeared, and we knew what that meant. Enemy attack was imminent. The hair on the back of my neck stood at rigid attention. After many a vicious gunfight in Ramadi, stand by to get some was a running joke that eased the tension right when we knew trouble was coming. The more nonchalantly it could be said under the direst of circumstances, the funnier it was. It was broad daylight as our patrol of SEALs and Iraqi soldiers made its way on foot down the narrow city street, bordered by high concrete walls on either side. Suddenly, the world exploded. Dozens of bullets snapped through the air, each with a sharp, supersonic crack, and smashed into the concrete wall next to me with thunderous impact. Shards of concrete flew everywhere. The heavy volleys of incoming fire sounded like multiple jackhammers simultaneously chewing up the street and the walls all around us. We had walked right into an enemy buzzsaw. Insurgent fighters hit us from multiple directions with belt-fed machine guns. I couldn't see them or where they were shooting from, but the number of enemy bullets flying through the air around us was crazy. There was no place to hide. With high walls on both sides, the narrow South Central Ramadi street provided no cover. The only thing between us and the enemy machine guns was a single parked car on the side of the road some distance up the block, and the typical trash strewn about. The patrol was in a dual column formation, each column split on opposite sides of the street, hunkered close to the walls. There was nothing to get behind that could protect us from bullets. But we did have something on our side. Devastating firepower. We fully expected a firefight on every patrol in this enemy-held neighborhood, and we rolled in heavy. Each squad of 8 SEALs packed at least 4 belt-fed machine guns to suppress any enemy attack we encountered. When we came under fire, our immediate response with violent and overwhelming gunfire provided the only answer: cover and move. Having learned through the humbling experience of months of urban combat, Task Unit Bruiser had had plenty of practice in this fundamental gunfighting principle. Within nanoseconds, the SEALs with the big machine guns up front unleashed the most ruthless and lethal barrage of fire you could imagine. Despite the intensity and the violence of close urban combat, I couldn't help but smile. Damn, I love those guys. The big, tough frogmen who carried the Mark 48 and Mark 46 machine guns and the weight of hundreds of rounds of ammunition in addition to their body armor, helmet, radio, water, and everything else they had to carry, all in the blistering heat of the Iraqi summer sun. Those SEAL machine gunners kept us alive. Our snipers killed a lot of bad guys and received many well-deserved accolades for it. But every time we were attacked, it was the SEAL machine gunners who suppressed the threat of enemy fire. Standing or kneeling, they fired their machine guns from the shoulder with incredible accuracy. That machine gun fire eliminated the insurgent fighters shooting at us or forced them to take cover, meaning they couldn't accurately engage us, which enabled us to maneuver, flank, or simply get off the street and out of harm's way. Despite the dozens of bullets hitting the street and the walls near us, no one was hit. That was the beauty of cover and move. As the commander of Charlie Platoon and the senior man on the ground, I was itching to make a call, pass a verbal command to peel back and choose a nearby building for a strong point where we could find protection behind concrete walls, set security, and take the high ground on the rooftop. From there, we could locate our attackers, send out a squad to flank them, or call in the tanks to blast them into oblivion. I had dreamed of being a combat leader since I was a kid. I had wanted to be a SEAL since at least middle school when I had learned about the legendary Navy Special Operations Unit. Leading intense combat operations in a place like Ramadi was the ultimate fulfillment of that dream. Every bone in my body wanted to step up and take charge, bark a verbal command that could be heard over the sound of intense gunfire. But I wasn't in charge. The leader of this particular combat operation was Charlie Platoon's most junior assistant platoon commander, or assistant officer in charge, AOIC, the least experienced officer in the platoon. It was his operation, and it was his call. I would certainly step in and make a call if he or others needed me to, when the situation called for it. But he was a great officer, and paired with Tony Afrati, our outstanding and highly experienced platoon chief. I had total faith in my AOIC, and he proved himself time and again. Rapidly, the AOIC pointed out a larger building in which to strongpoint. As the SEALs up front laid down suppressive fire, other SEALs moved to the entrance gate, the pathway off the street, and entered the compound. From my position, toward the middle of the patrol, I observed at least one enemy firing position, a few blocks in front of us, and I lobbed several 40mm grenades from my M203 grenade launcher mounted below my M4 rifle. I sent the high-explosive golden eggs up over the heads of our patrol and down onto the enemy position, where they exploded with a fiery blast. It was a small contribution, but an effective way to keep the bad guys' heads down, complementing our machine gun fire. I then moved up to the entrance gate of the compound and took position in the street just outside, directing guys inside the gate as they ran to catch up. Mark Lee, with his big Mark 48 machine gun, stood in the street just ahead of me, laying down belt after belt of devastating fire. Mark was a badass. He had us covered. Enemy rounds were still cracking by us and flying down the street, but with Mark laying the hammer down, the enemy fire was less accurate. I swiveled to face the rear of the patrol. One of the last SEALs still in the street was running hard in my direction. "Let's go," I yelled at him, waving him over with a hand motion toward the gate. Suddenly, Only feet from me and the safety of the concrete walls, the SEAL fell violently forward and landed hard, face down in the street. I rushed over to him in horror. Man down, I thought. He must have taken a round to the chest or head. I darted over, expecting to find him a bloody mess. I was surprised to see him lying there, smiling back up at me. "Are you all right?" I yelled over the sound of the gunfire. Bullets were still whizzing past us, kicking up dirt just a few feet away and ricocheting off the nearby walls. "I'm good," he replied. "I tripped." I smiled back in relief, thankful that he wasn't gravely wounded or dead. "Bro," I yelled over the noise of the firefight, "I thought you got your head shot off." We both chuckled. Quickly, I grabbed his hand and helped him to his feet. We sprinted the rest of the way back to the gate. As the SEAL ducked into the gate, I ran forward and slapped Mark on the back. "Last man," I yelled, letting him know we had everyone accounted for. I covered for Mark as he pulled back, pointing his big gun, barrel smoking, to the sky, and we ducked inside the gate together. Finally, everybody was off the street and out of the enemy line of fire, and inside the compound behind the cover of concrete walls. Thanks to Mark and our other machine gunners, supported by SEAL shooters with their M4 rifles, despite the vicious enemy attack with substantial firepower, none of us had been hit. I made my way to the rooftop, where SEAL shooters had taken up firing positions. As the enemy fighters moved from building to building and continued their attack, we engaged them. The AOIC was there on the roof, with our Charlie Platoon radioman, assessing the situation. "What do you want to do?" I asked him. "Let's call in the tanks for fire support," he said calmly. The AOIC was cool under fire, a great quality that every leader should work toward. "Roger that," I said. It was exactly the right call. We had the high ground on the rooftop. We had good security behind the concrete walls. The SEAL radioman contacted the U.S. Army company Team Bulldog and got the M1A2 Abrams tanks rolling our way with their massive firepower. We loved those soldiers, under the command of Captain Main Gun Mike Bahama. Despite the deadly threat of IEDs that destroyed a number of tanks in this South Central Ramadi neighborhood, every single time we called for help, Main Gun Mike personally loaded in his tank and fearlessly came to our aid, accompanied by another Bulldog tank. We could take great risk and patrol deep into dangerous enemy territory only because we knew that when we got into trouble, Team Bulldog had us covered. Mike and his soldiers were outstanding, aggressive warriors. They would do everything in their power to get to us, no matter how dangerous or difficult. And when they arrived in their tanks, they brought the thunder. It took several minutes for the tank crews to mount up and drive out to our location. We continued to take enemy fire from several directions. One SEAL operator peeked his head above the roof wall to determine where the bad guys were. As he did so, his head snapped back violently and he fell backward. He sat up, unharmed, wondering what the hell had just happened. When the SEAL took off his helmet to examine it, he found a deep gash where an enemy bullet had ricocheted off the night vision mount on the front of his helmet. Just an inch or two lower, and that round would have taken his head off. "What happened?" a SEAL next to him asked. "I got shot," he said with a smile, pointing to his helmet. It was a close call, but thankfully, one we could laugh about. As we waited on the rooftop, I switched my radio over to monitor Bulldog's company communications net. I heard Main Gun Mike ask if we could mark the buildings from where the enemy fighters were still shooting at us. "Do you have any red smoke grenades?" the radioman asked. I didn't have any. "We've got tracers," I suggested. The SEAL radioman had a full magazine of tracer rounds, which emitted a visible orange glow along the bullet path as they zipped through the air. Mark Lee also had tracers every fifth round in his ammunition belt. We relayed to Main Gun Mike and his tankers the plan. As the heavy Abrams tanks approached, tank tracks clattering on the concrete city street, I heard the word over the radio to mark the target and relayed the order via verbal command. "Mark the target," I yelled. Mark and the SEAL radioman lit up the enemy position with tracer fire. Stand by to get some, I thought, as Mike's Abrams tank rotated its huge turret and trained the mighty 120mm cannon at the buildings from where we had been receiving fire. The tank unleashed its thunderous fury into the building and ended the enemy attack. The insurgent fighters who hadn't been obliterated beat a hasty retreat. We received no more fire from the enemy that day, thanks to Mike and his Team Bulldog soldiers. Once again, the tanks had been our deliverance. The combined team of SEALs and U.S. Army soldiers had given the insurgents more than they could handle. And my AOIC had proven once again that he was a solid leader, competent and cool-headed, even under the stress of close combat. But just as my assistant platoon commander had to be ready to lead, in this situation, I had to be ready to follow. The goal of all leaders should be to work themselves out of a job. You never quite get there, but by putting junior leaders and frontline troops in charge, our SEAL platoon and task unit were far more effective. It created a culture of leaders at every level of the team. Trying to navigate between leadership and followership was an example of the dichotomy of leadership, the balance that every leader must find between two opposing forces in leadership. Ready to lead, but also knowing when to follow. Taking extreme ownership of everything that impacts the mission, but also empowering others to lead with decentralized command. The recognition of the many dichotomies and the ability to balance these opposing forces provide a powerful tool that enables leaders at every level to lead and win. The Dichotomy, Balancing the Challenges of Extreme Ownership. Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. Our first book, Extreme Ownership, struck a chord with many readers. The idea that leaders must take ownership, extreme ownership, of everything in their world, everything that impacts their mission, has changed the way people view leadership. If mistakes happen, effective leaders don't place blame on others. They take ownership of the mistakes, determine what went wrong, develop solutions to correct those mistakes, and prevent them from happening again as they move forward. Even the best teams and the best leaders never deliver flawless performances. No one can achieve perfection. What makes the best leaders and the best teams great is that when they make mistakes, they acknowledge them, take ownership, and make corrections to upgrade their performance. With each iteration, the team and its leaders enhance their effectiveness. Over time, that team runs circles around its competition, particularly against other teams with a culture of excuses and blame casting, where problems never get solved, and thus, performance never improves. Our 4 laws of combat have helped radically improve the performance of teams and organizations, large and small, across the United States and internationally, in nearly every industry in the business world, as well as military units, police and fire departments, charity organizations, school administrations, and sports teams. The first law of combat, cover and move. This is teamwork. Every individual and team within the team mutually supporting one another to accomplish the mission. Departments and groups within the team, and even those outside the immediate team that are nevertheless crucial to success, must break down silos and work together to win. It doesn't matter if one element within the group does its job. If the team fails, everybody fails. But when the overall team wins, everybody wins. Everyone gets to share in that success. The second law of combat, simple. Complexity breeds chaos and disaster, especially when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. When plans and orders get too complex, the people charged with executing those plans and orders do not understand them. When team members don't understand, they can't execute. Therefore, plans must be simplified so that everyone on the team recognizes the overall commander's intent, the greater purpose behind the mission, and understands their role in achieving mission success. Orders must be communicated in a manner that is simple, clear, and concise. The true test for whether plans and orders have been communicated effectively is this: the team gets it. When the people on the team understand, then they can execute. The third law of combat: prioritize and execute. When multiple problems occur simultaneously, which happens often, taking on too many problems at once results in failure. It is imperative that leaders detach themselves, pull back from the details, and assess to determine the highest priority to the strategic mission. Then, once that highest priority task has been determined, leaders must clearly communicate that priority to the team and ensure the team executes. Then the leaders in the team can move on to the next priority, then the next. Training and proper contingency planning assist greatly to better prepare teams and leaders to most effectively prioritize and execute under pressure in real time. The fourth law of combat: decentralized command. No one leader can manage it all or make every decision. Instead, leadership must be decentralized, with leaders at every level empowered to make decisions, right down to the frontline troopers in charge of no one but themselves and their small piece of the mission. With decentralized command, everyone leads. To empower everyone on the team to lead, team members must understand not just what to do, but why they are doing it. This requires clear and frequent communication up and down the chain of command, and most importantly, trust. Junior leaders must have confidence that they clearly understand the strategic mission, the commander's intent of their boss, and the parameters within which they can make decisions. Senior leaders must trust that their junior leaders will make the right decisions and encourage them to do so. This requires training and frequent communication to implement with maximum effectiveness. There was one big problem with the book Extreme Ownership: the title. While it drove home the most important leadership foundation in the book, it was also slightly misleading. Extreme ownership is the foundation of good leadership, but leadership seldom requires extreme ideas or attitudes. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Leadership requires balance. We addressed that concept in Chapter 12 of Extreme Ownership: Discipline equals Freedom, the Dichotomy of Leadership. But as we assessed legions of leaders in companies, teams, and organizations as they implemented the principles we taught in the book, many struggled to find that balance. This struggle represents the biggest challenge we observed as we trained and advised hundreds of companies and thousands of leaders over the past few years with our leadership consulting company, Echelon Front. In the final chapter of Extreme Ownership, we wrote, "Every leader must walk a fine line. Leadership requires finding the equilibrium in the dichotomy of many seemingly contradictory qualities between one extreme and another. The simple recognition of this is one of the most powerful tools a leader has. With this in mind, a leader can more easily balance the opposing forces and lead with maximum effectiveness. Every behavior or characteristic carried out by a leader can be taken too far. Leaders can become too extreme and upset the balance required to effectively lead a team. When balance is lost, leadership suffers, and the team's performance rapidly declines. Even the fundamental principles of combat leadership and extreme ownership can get out of balance. A leader can cover and move too much and step on the toes of other leaders, departments, or divisions. A plan can be too simple and fail to cover likely contingencies. A team can go too far with prioritize and execute, resulting in target fixation and loss of situational awareness on newly emerging problems and threats. Decentralized command can also be taken too far when too much autonomy is given to subordinate leaders who then don't fully understand strategic goals and how to execute in support of those goals. And this idea continues on with just about everything a leader does. Leaders must be close with their people, but not so close that it becomes a problem. They must hold the line with discipline, but not become tyrannical. A leader can even become too extreme with extreme ownership, when a leader takes so much ownership of everything in his or her world that members of the team feel there is nothing left for which they can take ownership. When this happens, team members will execute only at the boss's specific direction without any root ownership or buy-in themselves, resulting in a team far less capable of overcoming obstacles and accomplishing the mission. Therefore, balance in leadership is crucial to victory. It must be monitored at all times, and it must be modulated to specific situations as they arise. If a team member fails to perform adequately, for example, a leader must get down in the weeds and micromanage that member until he or she executes correctly. But once the team member gets back on track and resumes effective performance, the leader must maintain the ability to back off and give that team member room to take greater ownership and manage tasks on his or her own. It is not easy to maintain the constant shift, continual modulation, and frequent adjustment necessary to balance all the dichotomies across every spectrum of leadership characteristics. Yet, this skill is essential for effective leadership. We have observed these struggles continuously in good leaders striving to be better. That is what drove us to go deeper into the concept of the dichotomy of leadership. The goal of this book is to help leaders overcome that struggle through examples of how to find the right balance in leadership, to moderate the idea of leading from the extremes and focus on maintaining balance within teams, among peers, and both up and down the chain of command. Every good leader must develop the ability to recognize, understand, and adjust that balance. While it isn't easy, through knowledge, disciplined practice, and sustained effort, anyone can master finding the equilibrium in the dichotomy of leadership. Those who do will dominate their battlefield and lead their teams to victory.
Part 1. Balancing People. Chapter 1. The Ultimate Dichotomy. Jocko Willink. Charlie Medical Facility, Camp Ramadi, Iraq, 2006. Sir, the young SEAL whispered in a faint voice, "Come here." Our hands clasped in a handshake. Not a formal handshake like two businessmen, but palm to palm, with thumbs wrapped around the back of the hand like an arm wrestling contest. A handshake of brotherhood. The young SEAL was feeling the morphine. I saw in his eyes, but he was still there, still conscious and aware. He was everything a young man should be. Smart, brave, athletic, funny, loyal, and tough. He had been shot in the leg about a half an hour before. I found out later that Mikey Mansour, a young SEAL machine gunner, had run out into heavy enemy gunfire and dragged this SEAL out of a war-torn street in the Malab district in the city of Ramadi, the violent heart of the insurgency in Iraq. The wounded SEAL now lay on a gurney in Charlie Med, the Camp Ramadi field hospital, where U.S. military surgical teams worked furiously to save the lives of gravely wounded troops almost every day. The bullet, a mammoth, armor-piercing 7.62 by 54 millimeter round with a steel core, had entered his leg at the lower thigh, ripped apart flesh and bone inside his leg, and exited his upper thigh, close to the groin. It was hard to say if he would keep his leg. From the looks of the wound, my guess was no. He would lose it. The wounded SEAL's grip on my hand tightened. and he pulled me in, drawing me just inches from his face. I could tell he wanted to say something to me, so I turned my head and put my ear next to his mouth. I wasn't sure what to expect. Was he scared or angry or depressed that he might lose his leg? Was he nervous about what might happen next? Was he confused? He took a breath and then whispered, "Sir, let me stay. Let me stay, please. Don't make me go home. I'll do anything. I'll sweep up around camp. I can heal here. Please, please, please just let me stay with the task unit." There you go. Not scared, not angry, not depressed that he might lose his leg, only concerned that he might have to leave our task unit. Task Unit Bruiser. Our task unit. Our lives. This SEAL was our first significant casualty. We had had guys catch some frag on previous operations. We had had some very close calls. But this was the first wounded SEAL from Task Unit Bruiser whose life would be forever changed by a grave combat injury. Even if he kept his leg, the damage was so substantial that it didn't seem possible he would ever fully regain the extraordinary athleticism he had displayed previously. And yet, this SEAL was only concerned that he would let me down, let the task unit down, let his platoon, his team, down. This was a man. This was a true friend, a brother. This was a hero. Young, brave, and without question more concerned for his friends than for his own life. I was moved. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I fought them back and swallowed a lump in my throat. This was no time to break down. I was the leader. He needed me to be strong. "It's all right, brother. We've got to get you healed up first," I whispered. "As soon as you heal up, we'll get you back over here, but you have to get healed up first." "I'll be okay," the wounded SEAL replied. "Just let me stay. Let me stay." "Brother," I told him earnestly, "I'll bring you back as soon as you can stand. But you have to go and get yourself healed up." "I'll heal up here. I can work in the talk," he argued, referencing our tactical operations center, where we monitored combat missions via radio and television screens that displayed overhead video feed from aircraft, both manned and unmanned. "Listen," I told him, "that won't work. This wound is no joke. You're going to need real rehab, and we don't have that here for you. Go home. Heal up. Get back on your feet, and I'll get you back over here. I promise." I meant it. Whether he kept his leg or not, once he was stable enough, I would do all I could to bring him back. "Okay, sir," he replied, convinced that it wouldn't take long. "I'll be back soon." "I know you will, brother. I know you will," I told him. Soon, he was being loaded onto a medevac helicopter and flown to a more advanced medical facility where he would get the surgery he needed, a place where they might be able to save his leg. I went back to my camp, a compound of tents and buildings we called Shark Base, sandwiched between the large U.S. military base of Camp Ramadi and the Euphrates River. I went to my room on the second floor of that building that housed our talk, a once lavish structure with ornate columns that had previously belonged to members of Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, it was our headquarters and barracks, with sandbagged windows and makeshift furniture. I sat down on my crude bed, constructed of plywood and 2x4s. Reality set in. We were only 1 month into our deployment. My guys were getting in gunfights on a daily basis. The city of Ramadi, where we operated, was crawling with insurgents. And the insurgents were good. They were well-equipped, well-trained, and well-disciplined. They fought with tenacity and ruthlessness. Of course, we were better. Our training, gear, and attitude were among the best of any combat troops in the world. We were in Ramadi to make the city safe for the local populace by taking the fight to the enemy, to hunt the evil insurgents down in the streets and kill them. All of them. But we weren't bulletproof. We couldn't run around this city day in and day out and not expect to take casualties. If you cut wood, you get sawdust. When you wage war, especially in violent urban combat, you take casualties. That was the nature of the business. Oddly enough, up until this point, SEALs in Iraq had been very lucky. 3 years into the war, only a handful of SEALs had been wounded, and none had been killed. The incidents were fairly random, often more bad luck than anything else. But we weren't going to get lucky this whole deployment. The proof was evident as I'd just witnessed, seeing my wounded SEAL, pale from blood loss, hazy from morphine, and lucky, so extremely lucky to be alive. The wounded SEAL was a young man. This was only his second SEAL platoon and his second deployment to Iraq. He was an excellent SEAL operator and a crucial member of the team, a great guy to be around, faithful, loyal, funny. Although all the SEALs in the task unit were different, they were also, in many ways, the same. Sure, they had quirks and little personality traits that made them individuals. Of course, they were far from perfect. We all are. But at the same time, all of them, individually, were amazing people. Patriotic, selfless. They were in the teams, what we SEALs call our community of Naval Special Warfare SEAL teams, for the same reason. To serve, to do their duty, and to offer everything they had for the task unit, the team, and our great nation. And I was in charge of them. But being in charge fell short of explaining the way I felt about these men. All of them. They were my friends because I joked and laughed and carried on with them. They were my brothers because we shared the common bond of our fraternal order. They were also like my children because I was responsible for what they did, good and bad. And it was my job to protect them to the best of my ability. I had to overwatch them as they overwatched the city from rooftops and moved through the violent streets. They gave me everything they had. At work, in training, and now on the battlefield. In turn, they were everything to me. In many ways, I was closer to them than I was to my own parents, my siblings, even my wife and actual children. Of course, I loved my family, but the men in this task unit were also my family, and I wanted nothing more than to take care of them. But as much as I wanted to protect them, we had a job to do. A job that was violent and dangerous and unforgiving. A job that required me to put them at risk, tremendous risk, over and over and over again. This was an example of the dichotomy of leadership. Perhaps the ultimate dichotomy of leadership that a combat leader must face. It is a combat leader's duty to care about his troops more than anything else in the world. And yet, at the same time, a leader must accomplish the mission. That means the leader must make decisions and execute plans and strategies that might cost the men he loves so much their very lives. And this was incredibly difficult for me. Because in Ramadi, it wasn't a matter of if we would lose someone. It was a matter of when. This is not to say I was fatalistic. I wasn't. It doesn't mean I thought we had to take casualties. I prayed we would not. We did everything we could to mitigate the risks we could control in order to prevent casualties. But it did mean that I was facing reality. The reality was that U.S. Army soldiers and Marines were being wounded and killed every day in Ramadi. Every day. We continually attended memorial services for these fallen heroes. I recognized that this deployment to Ramadi was completely different from my first deployment to Iraq in 2003-2004, where things had been much more controlled and much less kinetic. In Ramadi, in 2006, the violent, sustained urban combat held risks that were beyond our control. And every day that my men were in the field, which was almost every day, I knew it could be the day. That was the heaviest burden of command. And then, the day came. On August 2nd, 2006, Leif and his Charlie Platoon SEALs, along with the Iraqi Army platoon for whom they were combat advisors, teamed up with our U.S. Army brethren from Team Bulldog for a large clearance operation in south-central Ramadi. The operation kicked off in the early morning hours, and for the first hour or so, all was quiet. Suddenly, a single shot rang out, quickly followed by a frantic man-down call over the radio. Ryan Job, an outstanding young Charlie Platoon SEAL machine gunner, had been hit in the face by an enemy sniper's bullet. He was gravely wounded. All hell broke loose in South Central as insurgents started shooting from multiple directions. Leif and Charlie Platoon fought to get Ryan evacuated, and Team Bulldog M2 Bradley fighting vehicles and M1A2 Abrams tanks came to their rescue with heavy firepower. Charlie Platoon loaded Ryan into a medevac vehicle and sent him off the battlefield to proper medical care. Then Leif and the rest of Charlie Platoon and their Iraqi soldiers patrolled back to combat Outpost Falcon, or Cop Falcon, a fortified U.S. Army position several dangerous blocks away. But the fighting in south-central Ramadi only escalated as enemy fighters flooded the area. Charlie Platoon could hear gunfire as their U.S. Army brethren from Team Bulldog, Main Gun Mike and his soldiers, were still engaged in a vicious firefight that spread across multiple city blocks. Leif and the leadership of his platoon discussed it briefly, and finally Leif called me on the radio and requested permission to go back out and take down some buildings where suspected enemy fighters were holed up. "Do it," I told him. Leif and his platoon did everything they could to mitigate risk. They rode to the suspected buildings in heavily armored Bradley fighting vehicles. They had the Bradleys soften the target buildings with fire from their powerful 25mm chain guns. They even had the Bradleys ram through the walls of the compounds so that the platoon could get off the open street and have some protection from enemy bullets as they moved toward the buildings to breach the entryways. But even that couldn't mitigate all the risk. And it didn't. I watched on the live video feed from a drone overhead as Charlie Platoon dismounted from the Bradleys and entered a building. I could tell the gunfire was heavy. Once my SEALs entered the building, I could no longer see what was happening. A few long minutes after they entered, I saw a group of SEALs carrying a casualty out of the building and back to a waiting Bradley nearby. It was one of ours. A lifeless body. As I watched from the talk, a horrible pit opened up in my stomach. I wanted to cry and scream and throw up and shake my fists at the sky. But I had to stifle those emotions. I had a job to do. So I simply stood by the radio and waited for Leif to call me. I did not call him because I knew he had work to do and I did not want to interfere with what he was doing. A few minutes later, he called. I could tell he was forcing himself to sound calm, but I heard a flood of emotions in his voice. He gave the report. As Charlie Platoon entered the building, they were engaged by enemy fighters from an adjacent building. As SEAL machine gunner Mark Lee courageously stepped into a doorway to engage the enemy fighters and protect the rest of his SEAL teammates entering the hallway behind him, he was struck by enemy fire and killed. It was over instantly. Mark Allen Lee, an amazing warrior, friend, brother, son, husband, uncle, man of faith, comedian, and truly incredible spirit of a human being, was gone. This was on top of the fact that Ryan Jobe, another Charlie Platoon machine gunner and saint of a human being, had already been severely wounded and was in a medically induced coma and en route to surgical facilities in Germany. Ryan's fate was yet unknown. The burden of such loss settled heavily on my soul. When Leif got back to base, I could see his heart was heavy with grief. His eyes were filled not only with tears, but with doubt and questions and the solemn weight of responsibility. Leif never even mentioned that he had also been wounded. A bullet fragment had entered his back, just missing the protection provided by his body armor. He didn't care about his wounded flesh. It was his heart that was broken. A day passed. Leif came into my office. I could see his soul was in absolute turmoil. As the leader on the ground, Leif had made the decision to go back into the firestorm. I had approved that decision, but it was Leif who carried the burden that he had survived, and Mark had not. I feel like I made the wrong decision, Leif said quietly. I just wish I could take it back. I wish I would have done something, anything differently. So Mark would still be here, with us. I could see that this was tearing Leif apart. He felt that in all that chaos and all that madness, he could have made a different decision, chosen a different path. But he was wrong. No, Leif, I told him slowly, there was no decision to make. Those army soldiers were in a vicious battle, a massive fight, and they needed our help. They needed our support. You gave it to them. The only other option would have been to sit back and let the army fight it out by themselves. You couldn't let Charlie Platoon sit inside the protected compound and let Team Bulldog take the risk and take the casualties. That's not what we do. We are a team. We take care of each other. There was no other choice. There was no decision to make. Leif was quiet. He looked at me and slowly nodded. As hard as it was to hear, he knew I was right. He knew he couldn't have sat on the sidelines while other Americans were in harm's way and needed help in what was probably the largest single engagement in the months-long campaign of the Battle of Ramadi. If he had, everyone in the platoon would have known it was the wrong decision. Leif would have known it was wrong too. But with the weight of such a burden on his soul, he needed more reassurance. So I continued, we are frogmen. We are SEALs. We are American fighting men. If there is something we can do to help our brothers in arms, we help. That is what we do. You know that. Mark knew that. We all know that. That is who we are. I just wish I could trade places with Mark, Leif said, His eyes teared up with emotion. I'd do anything to bring him back. Look, I said, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know when guys are going to get wounded or killed. If we could know that, then we wouldn't go out on those particular operations, but we don't know. We can't know. The only way we can guarantee everyone will be safe is to do nothing at all and let other troops do the fighting. But that is wrong, and you know it. We must do our utmost to win. Of course, we have to mitigate whatever risks we can, but in the end, we cannot eliminate every risk. We still have to do our duty. Leif nodded again. He knew I was right. He believed it, because it was the truth. But it did not take away the punishing torment of losing Mark. Mark's death was something Leif would carry with him forever. I already knew that. And so did Leif. It was difficult to grasp. The hardest and most painful of all the dichotomies of leadership, to care about your men more than anything in the world, so much so that you'd even willingly trade your life for theirs, and yet, at the same time, to lead those men on missions that could result in their deaths. Even back in the States, in a non-hostile environment, SEAL training and preparation for deployment was dangerous. To mitigate every danger would mean that trainees could never conduct parachute jumps, fast rope from helicopters, board ships from small boats, drive vehicles in high-speed convoys at night using only night vision, or conduct live-fire training drills. Unfortunately, every few years, despite strong safety measures and controls, a SEAL is killed or seriously injured during this high-risk training. And yet, to not take the risks inherent in conducting realistic training would put more SEALs in even greater danger when they deployed to combat zones not fully prepared for missions they would be called upon to execute. So even though a leader must care deeply for his troops, a leader must also put those troops at risk in training, and even more so in combat. Of course, it is incumbent upon the leader to mitigate the risks that can be controlled, but there will always be risks beyond the leader's control, and the potential consequences can be deadly. That dichotomy of caring for your men's welfare while simultaneously putting them at risk to accomplish the mission is something felt by every combat leader and was felt to the core by the leaders on the ground in Ramadi. Because while we were determined to do our utmost to close with and destroy the enemy to help secure Ramadi, we also knew that victory would be paid for in the blood of our most promising young American men and women. And the blood continued to be shed by Task Unit Bruiser. After Ryan was wounded and Mark was killed, we took other minor casualties, small flesh wounds and little injuries, but nothing serious. Then, on September 29th, only weeks from the end of our deployment, Leif and I were in our Tactical Operations Center listening to the radio traffic while the other SEAL platoon of Task Unit Bruiser, Delta Platoon, was outside the wire on a combat operation. We listened as Delta Platoon reported enemy movement and passed updates on enemy fighters killed, all of which were part of an ordinary day in Ramadi. Then we heard Delta Platoon's request for casualty evacuation. From the radio traffic, it was clear that several SEALs were wounded. It sounded severe. My heart sank. Immediate support from a U.S. Army Quick Reaction Force rapidly launched and headed to Delta Platoon's position. A few minutes later, the U.S. Army Tactical Operations Center radioed that multiple SEALs were wounded, with one SEAL described as urgent surgical, meaning he needed immediate medical attention and was at risk of dying. We continued to listen to the radio calls solemnly, with hopes that our wounded brothers, especially the critically wounded ones, would be okay. A call from the battalion commander of the 1st of the 506th shattered those hopes. He gave me the grave news. 3 of the men were wounded, but each had injuries that would heal. They were not at risk of losing life or limb. But then this bold and professional battalion commander grew quiet for a moment. He told me a 4th man was also wounded. Mikey Mansour was hurt very badly. His voice trembled slightly. He told me he didn't think Mikey was going to make it. For what seemed like an eternity, Leif and I waited for an update. Finally, we got word from the field hospital that crushed our souls. Michael Anthony Mansour, an exceptional young SEAL, beloved by everyone in the platoon and the task unit, another saint of a human being, an unbelievably strong, determined, kind, compassionate, and inspiring young man, had died from his wounds. Once the rest of Delta Platoon had been extracted from the field, I received a call from my friend Seth Stone, the Delta Platoon commander who gave me the details of what had occurred on the operation. He told me that an enemy fighter had tossed a hand grenade onto the rooftop of one of Delta Platoon's sniper overwatch positions. In the most completely selfless act possible, Mikey Mansour heroically dove on top of that grenade, shielding 3 of his teammates from the blast. He sacrificed himself to save them. The operation would likely have been Mikey's last mission in Ramadi, just days before he was scheduled to fly home. Just as Leif struggled with the loss of Mark, Seth bore the crushing weight of losing Mikey. Seth continued to lead missions and completed his turnover with the SEALs who had arrived to replace us, but I could tell his soul was tormented by the loss of Mikey. When we got back to America, only a few short weeks after Mikey's death, Seth told me his feelings as we sat in our task unit office after work. "I feel like it's my fault that Mikey died. I feel responsible," Seth told me with tears in his eyes. I thought about it for a moment and then told him the truth. We are responsible. I paused for a moment. Seth didn't say a word. He was surprised by what I had said. "We are responsible," I said again. "It was our strategy. We came up with it. We knew the risks. You planned the missions. I approved them. We were the leaders. And we are responsible for everything that happened during that deployment. Everything. That's the way it is. We can't escape that. That is what being a leader is." I looked at Seth. It was clear that his heart was broken. Both Leif and Seth, as tough as they were on the battlefield, as determined as they were to accomplish their missions, as aggressive as they were in pursuit of the enemy, cared for and loved their guys more than anything else in the world. They would have given anything to trade places with their fallen men. Anything. But that wasn't an option. That isn't the way the world works. And now, here they both were, dealing with the aftermath of the ultimate dichotomy of leadership. As much as you care for your men, as a leader, you have to do your duty. You have to accomplish the mission, and that involves risk, and it could very well cost people's lives. My last statement was sinking into Seth's mind. Finally, he spoke. "I keep replaying the mission in my mind, trying to figure out what I could have done differently. Maybe I should have put that Overwatch in a different building. Maybe I should have told them to set up on the second floor instead of on the rooftop. Maybe we shouldn't have even done this mission. His voice got more emotional as he listed these thoughts. Seth, I told him calmly, hindsight is 20/20. There are a million things that could have been done differently if we knew exactly what was going to unfold that day, but we didn't. You picked that building because it was the best tactical position in the area. You had guys on the roof because that gave them the best visibility and thereby the best protection. And you did this mission because that is what we do. We take the fight to the enemy. You had done countless operations like this. You mitigated every risk possible, but you couldn't know the outcome. Seth nodded. Like Leif, he knew this was true. But it did not alleviate the pain of losing Mikey. Over the next few weeks, as we stood down from deployment, turned in gear, and completed administrative requirements, Seth and I talked about his future. Leif and I had orders to report to training commands so we could pass on the leadership lessons we had learned in Ramadi to the next generation of SEALs who would go forward into the fray in Iraq and Afghanistan. Seth was undecided on what to do next with his life. He wasn't sure if he was going to stay in the Navy. It had been a hard deployment. Under constant pressure for 6 straight months, Seth had suffered several of his men wounded and 1 killed. He had faced fear and death on an almost daily basis. At the same time, SEAL Team 3 needed someone to take over my job as commander of Task Unit Bruiser. They had offered the job to Seth. I don't know, he told me. I don't know if I can do it again. I know, I told him, understanding his mentality. He had been through hell. You don't have to take the job. You can do whatever you want. You can get out of the teams, travel, surf, go get your MBA, make a bunch of money. You can go do all that. And that is cool if you want to. You've done more for me and for the teams than I ever could have asked of you. But I'll tell you something else. There are 2 SEAL platoons that need a leader. They need someone to look out for them and take care of them on and off the battlefield. You have more combat experience than anyone on this team. No one could do a better job leading this task unit than you can. You can do whatever you want. But these guys, they need you. They need a leader. And that isn't going to change. Seth sat quietly for a few seconds. He had given everything in Ramadi. He had so many opportunities waiting if he got out of the Navy. He was extremely intelligent, creative, and industrious, and he already had an incredible resume. I knew Seth had aspirations beyond the military to pursue other different challenges as a civilian. I would understand if he walked away from the Navy. He had done his share. I sat and watched Seth ponder silently. Then I saw his expression change, and a look of confidence came across his face. "All right," Seth said as he stood up from his chair. "All right what?" I asked. "I'm going," he said as he moved toward the door. "Going where?" I asked. "I'm going to tell the executive officer that I'm taking this task unit. I'm taking command of Task Unit Bruiser. I have to," he said. "There is no decision to make." Seth smiled and walked out the door. There is no decision to make, I thought to myself. Even with all those other options in life, there was no other option for Seth. He knew what the right thing was, he knew his duty, and he did it. Just as he had in Ramadi, time and time again, Seth stepped forward. he stepped up. He shouldered the heavy burden of command once more to struggle with the opposing forces that make up the countless dichotomies of leadership. To balance being a leader and being a follower, being confident but not cocky, to be aggressive but still cautious, to be bold but at the same time thoughtful. And most significant, he chose to face the ultimate dichotomy. To train, work with, and develop a team of friends and brothers to care about those men more than anything in the world, and then lead those men on missions that could get them killed. That is the burden. That is the challenge. That is the dichotomy. That is leadership. Principle. There are limitless dichotomies in leadership, and a leader must carefully balance between these opposite forces. But none are as difficult as this: to care deeply for each individual member of the team while at the same time accepting the risks necessary to accomplish the mission. A good leader builds powerful, strong relationships with his or her subordinates. But while that leader would do anything for those team members, the leader must recognize there is a job to do. And that job might put the very people the leader cares so much about at risk. In war, this is the ultimate dichotomy. A leader may have to send his most treasured asset, his people, into a situation that gets them wounded or killed. If his relationships are too close and he can't detach from his emotions, he might not be able to make tough choices that involve risk to his men. With that attitude, the team will get nothing done. That team fails the mission. At the other end of the spectrum, if a leader cares too much about accomplishing the mission, he may sacrifice the health and safety of his men without gaining any significant advantage. Beyond the horrible impact it has on the men, it also impacts the team, who recognize the leader as callous and no longer respect and follow him. The team will fall apart. While not as extreme, this dichotomy reveals itself in the civilian sector as well. This is one of the most difficult dichotomies to balance, and it can be easy to go too far in either direction. If leaders develop overly close relationships with their people, they may not be willing to make those people do what is necessary to complete a project or task. They may not have the wherewithal to lay off individuals with whom they have relationships, even if it is the right move for the good of the company. And some leaders get so close to their people that they don't want to have hard conversations with them. They don't want to tell them that they need to improve. On the other hand, if a leader is too detached from the team, he or she may overwork, overexpose, or otherwise harm its members while achieving no significant value from that sacrifice. The leader may be too quick to fire people to save a buck, thereby developing the reputation of not caring about the team beyond its ability to support the strategic goals. So leaders must find the balance. They must push hard without pushing too hard. They must drive their team to accomplish the mission without driving them off a cliff. Application to business. These people work hard, the regional manager told me emphatically. He oversaw 5 mining operations, which pulled raw materials out of the ground and sold them on the market as commodities. It was a straightforward business. The cheaper the cost of production, the more money the business made. But even with commodities, human beings' lives and livelihoods come into play. I know they do. I've seen them out there in the field, I replied. You've seen them for a few hours. That's nothing compared to the days, weeks, months, and years on end these folks work to make this place function. The regional manager replied in an aggressive tone. The regional manager clearly didn't think I got it. I looked at it from his perspective. He was right. I couldn't fully appreciate what these men and women did every day in the mines. But his aggressiveness also came from the fact that he thought I was one of them, one of the corporate know-it-alls who had been sent down from the ivory tower to help try to fix his problem. He was, of course, right. I had been sent from corporate to help him fix his problem. 8 months ago, corporate shut down one of his mines, moving the number of mines he oversaw from 6 down to 5. The cost to produce had become too high, and the mine simply wasn't going to make enough money. When they shut it down, the regional manager kept about a quarter of the employees on board, spreading them around his other mines. Corporate fought this, but he fought harder, assuring his chain of command that with the additional manpower at each of the remaining mines, production would increase across the board. But it seemed evident that what really drove the regional manager's decision was the fact that he cared about his workforce, truly and deeply cared. He was a third-generation miner. He knew the hardships of the job. My conversation with him was not going well. I had to de-escalate. I know that I don't fully understand how hard they work, I told him, admitting I didn't completely know the level of effort his people put in. I'm definitely no expert, but it is certainly obvious how hard they work, even from only a couple hours' worth of observation. That wasn't good enough for the regional manager. They aren't just hard workers, he responded. They have skills. They are some of the best operators in the world. Take Miguel over there on the backhoe. He is one of the best I've ever seen. He pointed out the window at a massive backhoe busily moving earth into a giant dump truck. Yeah, he runs that thing like it was part of his body. He is good, I told the regional manager. And you know what? The regional manager continued. He isn't just a good equipment operator, he's a good man. He's got a wife and 4 kids, good kids. Family man, I confirmed. Damn right, the regional manager told me. Damn right. Well, let's go to the office and talk through some of these numbers, I said, not wanting to put off the inevitable conversation any longer. The regional manager knew the numbers better than I did. The surplus of personnel from the mine that had closed had increased production at each of his remaining mines, but not by nearly enough to make up for the added expenses. He had too many employees now, and he knew it. The remaining 5 mining operations for which he was responsible were not making enough money. We went into his office and sat down. I know what you're going to say, he told me. From the tone of his voice, I could tell he wanted to pick a fight. He wanted to be mad at me. I had to tread carefully. Well, I guess I don't need to say much then, I said. The numbers speak for themselves. The numbers don't tell the whole story, the regional manager declared. Of course they don't, I responded, but the numbers tell the part of the story that pays the bills. There's more to it than that, he replied, clearly frustrated. I know there is, I told him, trying to be empathetic. Do you? He responded aggressively. I decided I needed to put him in check. Yes, I firmly told him. Yes, I absolutely do know. The regional manager sat there looking at me, slightly surprised at my tone as I now claimed to understand his business. But it wasn't his business I was claiming to know. It was the situation he was facing as a leader. I know there are lots of people out there, I said. Lots of people that depend on you to make the right decisions. Decisions that determine if they will continue to have a job or not. Decisions that determine if they can pay their mortgage and put food on the table for their families. Those are heavy decisions, and those are hard decisions. I've been there. I've had people's lives hinging upon decisions that I made, on what missions we did, on what areas we went into, on who I assigned to do what. I sent my men, my friends, my brothers into harm's way over and over and over again. And the outcome was not always good. The regional manager was now listening, really listening to me for the first time. I had finally connected with him. Look, I continued, you are the leader, and that comes with a heavy burden. In the military, we call it the burden of command. It is the responsibility you feel for the lives of the people who work for you. In the SEAL teams, I was dealing with lives. Here, you deal with people's livelihoods. It isn't the exact same thing, but it's close. People are counting on you to keep their paychecks coming so they can feed their families. And you care about these people, just as you should. Just like I cared about my men. They were everything to me. They still are. That is one of the most difficult dichotomies of leadership. What is? The regional manager asked. The fact that you care about your people more than anything, but at the same time, you have to lead them. And as a leader, you might have to make decisions that hurt individuals on your team. But you also have to make decisions that will allow you to continue the mission for the greater good of everyone on the team. If military leaders decided that they were simply going to shield their troops from every risk at all costs, what would they get accomplished? Well, they wouldn't accomplish anything, he admitted. That's exactly right, I said. Where would our country be without our military doing its job? I'll tell you, we wouldn't even have a country. That's why military leaders have to do what they do, and you are sitting in a very similar position. You've done everything you can to save jobs, but the work isn't there. It just isn't. You've been struggling for 8 months. How many employees did you transfer from the mine that closed? I asked him. 147 people, the regional manager answered. And how many people did you employ at your other 5 mines prior to the transfer? I asked. About 600, he said. So, in an effort to try and save the jobs of 147 employees, I noted, you are putting at risk the other 5 mines and 600 jobs, the entire mission. If you don't make some hard decisions, that is exactly what will happen. The regional manager sat quietly. It was sinking in. I could see it in his eyes. But I don't know. I don't know if I can do it, he said soberly. Some of these folks are like family to me. Well, let me tell you this, I replied. If you don't step up and lead, what do you think corporate will do? They'll either shut us down or... He trailed off, not wanting to admit the other obvious possibility. Or what? I asked him. Or get rid of me, he replied. Exactly, I agreed. Now, what would be better for everyone here? To get shut down completely? Or to have someone else who doesn't care as much for the team as you do come in, take over, and drive down costs by chopping the staff to the extreme? I know it's hard, I know. But if you don't do what you need to do, what you know you need to do, you aren't helping anyone. And you definitely aren't leading. In fact, just the opposite. If you don't make the hard decision, you will be hurting the people you care about, not helping them. That's another dichotomy. In order to help your team, sometimes you have to hurt them. Just like a doctor performing surgery. Surgery is a brutal thing, cutting open a body and removing parts of it, then sewing it back together. But in order to save a life, a surgeon has to do just that. What you have to do here is also brutal. I get it. But failure to do it is going to have far more brutal consequences. The regional manager was nodding. He understood. He was a good-hearted leader who cared for his people, an admirable and important quality in a leader. But he had strayed too far and unbalanced the dichotomy by caring more about his people than he did about the mission. He lost sight of what was most important strategically. To protect some employees, he had placed his entire mission and every other employee at risk. Now, he understood that doing so was a failure of leadership. Once he acknowledged this, he could then course correct and rebalance the dichotomy. He had to make the tough decisions. He didn't like it, but he understood. Over the next 2 weeks, the regional manager let go of almost 80 people. He didn't like it, but he had to do it. He had to lead. The cost savings moved the mines from the red into the black. They were profitable once again and on a sustainable path for the foreseeable future. The regional manager now understood this most difficult dichotomy of leadership. A leader must care about the troops, but at the same time, the leader must accomplish the mission. And in doing so, there will be risks and sometimes unavoidable consequences to the troops. The regional manager now realized that he had to balance caring for his people with accomplishing the mission, and that failing to balance those two opposing goals would result in his failure to do either.